The Communist Party of China is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin, there's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places, but the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went.
You know who that is? That was Marco Rubio in his Senate confirmation hearing to be the U.S. Secretary of State. Like many top leaders of the new Trump administration, Rubio spoke on an existential competition between Washington and Beijing. And the battlefield for their rivalry? For Rubio, it's Latin America and other regions in the world where China and the U.S. are both trying to advance strategic partnerships, investment, trade, and infrastructure. You've listened here. This new U.S. administration is focused on tariffs, the Panama Canal, and the Chinese products dominating markets around the region. China President Xi Jinping, meanwhile, just announced a $9 billion credit line to Latin American countries and more plans for major infrastructure investment in the region.
In the face of the bloc confrontation and the surging tide of unilateralism and protectionism, China would like to join hands with the Latin countries to seek development and prosperity and build up a China-Latin American community of a shared future.
Hi, this is Luisa Leme with ASCOA Online. Welcome back to Latin American Focus. We've talked a lot in the show about U.S. foreign policy and how the country is competing with China in Latin America. But are the rules of the game, or even the way these world powers see the game, changing? Our guest today says that both Washington and Beijing have been recalibrating their approach in the region.
There seems to have been a shift in thinking about how to engage globally on the part of the United States, which does not necessarily embrace, right, some of the values that we've upheld in our foreign policy and through private companies in the United States, for a matter of decades.
We spoke with Margaret Myers. She's a managing director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, and an amazing thinker of the U.S. China relationship and how it plays out in Latin America. In this conversation with my colleague Chase Harrison, Myers explains the U.S. recent actions in Latin America to counter its biggest competitor, what changed in China's economy and government priorities, and how countries from Panama to Argentina to Peru are navigating the opportunities and the demands of both world powers.
These countries are coming around to the idea, and they have been for a very long time, right, that diversification of partnerships, reliance on multiple actors, and not just China and the United States, but others too, is really the best path forward. And that's going to inevitably mean that not everything that the U.S. asks for is going to be honored.
If you haven't already, subscribe and review Latin American Focus and send this episode to your friend who's a China Latin America aficionado. Here is Margaret Myers with Chase Harrison.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Margaret, thanks for coming on the Latin America in Focus podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
One of the major focuses in the first couple weeks of the Trump administration was this notion of a competition between the United States and China, especially in regions like Latin America. It was a theme we heard a lot about in the confirmation hearings of several top cabinet officials, like Marco Rubio. I thought we'd start by better understanding how the second Trump administration conceptualizes this competition. Do they see it the same as previous administrations, as the first Trump administration, or do they have a new viewpoint on this competition?
That's a really great question, Chase, and one actually that I've been thinking a lot about. My sense is that there's a very different view of the potential threat that China poses in the Latin American region under this Trump administration than under even Trump 1, right? And also certainly under the Biden administration. The Biden administration really approached this with an understanding of economic security in mind, be it both U.S. economic security and also hemispheric economic security, really looking for opportunities to establish supply chains within the region, and that would, as a result, preclude more in the way of Chinese engagement in some of these areas, both through measures that would even the playing field, but also by providing new opportunities. This administration, in my perspective, right, my humble perspective, really views so much of what China is doing in the region through a primarily national security lens. And by that, I mean a U.S. national security lens. And you see this in part based on the things that really are attracting the most attention, right? So China's engagement in the region is expansive, primarily in the economic realm, and so much is happening at this juncture across industries, across economic sectors in all countries in the region through the pillars, I would say, of the Belt and Road Initiative, right, which include everything from infrastructure to financial integration to, policy coordination, people-to-people engagement. All of these things really feature quite prominently and have only been growing year after year in many, many different ways. But the areas of focus that we're seeing most extensively on the part of this administration are on port development, especially port development that has some sort of dual use or is presumed to have some sort of dual use capacity, meaning both civilian and military usage capabilities. ICT certainly also features, ICT meaning information and communications technology, right, is also a very big focus, but mostly through the lens of whether or not these ICT investments have certain surveillance or other capabilities. And then the other is in critical minerals, right, which this carries over certainly, administration after administration as we see China having far more control over the critical minerals supply chain. And so it's a very different conceptualization. And I think a lot of this concern, right, these concerns about national security issues stem from a broader concern or expectation that there will be some sort of eventual conflict with or contingency in the Taiwan Strait, right? That there will be some sort of conflict to the point of a military escalation, right, with China, and that China would be able to use its leverage over certain countries, its ownership of certain assets to have a favorable position in the event of that contingency.
We definitely saw that play into the way the Trump administration has approached the Panama Canal. There's been suggestion from Trump himself that Chinese presence in the canal gives them the capability to potentially even shut down that critical waterway. Certainly, there's been these high-profile fights, but what else are we seeing on the ground with how this national security approach plays into U.S. policy across the region? Has there been concrete action?
There have been things that have happened over the years, right, to try to advance the U.S. position and put the U.S. in a better overall negotiating, right, position with countries in the region, with partners in the region, to be able to ensure that certain particular investments that are of critical national security interest to the United States do not move forward. And there are multiple examples of U.S. efforts, even under the Biden administration, but certainly under Trump 1 too, right, to try to dissuade certain governments from pursuing contracts with China on surveillance-related initiatives, right, or those with the prospect of surveillance on critical infrastructure investment that, again, would potentially have some dual-use capability. This has happened in Chile. Obviously, Panama is a terrific example of this. These are very focused, right, efforts to address priority potential investments by China or contracts with China, right, for the provision of technologies, even financing arrangements, right, that would promote importation of Chinese goods for surveillance or other data processing projects. But, so I think this is not a new thing by any means. However, the bigger issue, right, is that China is becoming very quickly the dominant economic player in the region. If we're talking about influence, right, which is the usage of these facilities for military purposes by China is predicated on the notion that these countries would be okay with that, right? And if they're going to be okay with that, they need to have an understanding that China is their top partner, right, that they have ultimate confidence in what China is looking to do, and that a decision to not promote or China's interests or not support China's interests in this respect would be disadvantageous, especially from an economic perspective. And I think increasingly, given the extent of Chinese engagement, especially on the trade front, but then as an increasingly important investor in certain sectors that are growth promoting in different countries in the region, the perception of that is growing. And so simply targeting certain investments, right, or certain projects, it may result in some immediate effects as concerns those particular projects, but it's not addressing the overall issue, right, which is one in which there is a major shift in the power balance in the Western Hemisphere. We risk, I think, across the board, losing the forest for the trees. If you're only dealing with a tree at a time, right, you're still not addressing the issue, the broader issue, which is that, the dynamic is shifting in fundamental ways that will have implications for the extent of U.S. influence even on these particular projects.
You've been on the forefront of trying to get the U.S. government to see the forest, so to speak. You recently testified in front of the Senate about Chinese involvement in Latin America, and you said forceful measures will generate immediate effects, but only for so long. Can you tell me a little bit what you meant by that? And do you have a sense of what the longer-term vision for the second Trump administration is with tackling this large-scale trend of trade shifting towards China?
When I wrote that, I was thinking primarily about Panama. And I think certainly there are concessions that certain countries will be willing to make, noting that the U.S. is also a critical economic and political partner and has been historically for a very long time. But eventually, right, they are going to need to weigh the risks and benefits of all of the decisions they're making in the midst of great power competition and its effects in their respective countries. And in these instances, they will at times judge that it makes sense to align with the U.S. on some of these issues. In other instances, they will make the determination, I think, increasingly, that aligning with China with the expectation of more trade, more investment at a moment when many are looking to grow their economies, to address critical development issues, right, to pursue certain projects that they view as critical to their broader development strategies and plans, to achieve, some degree of energy transformation. They're going to judge that it is not in their best interest to do what the U.S. says, even if the U.S. seeks some form of retaliation. So they will be weighing the risks and benefits of all of this, and it's not always going to be the U.S. that comes out on top. It will be in certain instances and with certain countries, but that is not guaranteed, right? And I think even this negotiation with Argentina recently that we saw, this question of whether Argentina should extend its credit swap, right, with a currency swap arrangement. I think even there, the determination, I believe, will be that Argentina moves forward in some form or another with some sort of financial agreement with China. There's not much other recourse, right? There's not another strategy that Argentina can pursue at this juncture, given how much it has relied on China and on these agreements over the years and across administrations. So even there, I think there's a determination that there needs to be continued engagement with China. And increasingly, we see Milei, really taking a different stance, using very different terminology and when describing Argentina's engagement with China and embracing even, executives that are involved in the lithium sector in certain provinces in Argentina. And so these countries are coming around to the idea, and they have been for a very long time, right, that diversification of partnerships, reliance on multiple actors, and not just China and the United States, but others too, is really the best path forward. And that's going to inevitably mean that not everything that the U.S. asks for is going to be honored.
There's this rhetoric around the U.S. and China that we've heard, even from top Trump officials, that they need to pick a side. They need to pick the U.S. or China. And I wanted to ask you, is that possible? And if so, what does that even look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with sort of those areas that I mentioned before that are of specific and critical interest to the United States from a national security perspective, right? So pick a side on telecoms, pick a side on critical infrastructure, pick a side on, potentially on critical minerals or something of that nature. Even in those areas, right, it's very difficult for these countries to pick a side. There are not U.S. companies, right, that are building critical infrastructure, especially not something the scale of the Chancay port in Peru. There are not U.S. companies that offer 5G small cell technology, right? The U.S. does not have a dog in the fight, so to speak. That notion that there needs to be a decision to align with one of these countries or the other, the U.S. or China, right, I think strikes Latin American countries as an impossibility. And that they see partnership on certain initiatives with both as being of strategic interest as well. Often what we see China doing is complementary to what the U.S. has done, at least historically speaking. In other cases where there is direct competition or there is a national security interest, I think there will be continued and considerable pressure on those countries to really choose one technology over another, one system over another, one set of standards over the other.
One aspect of the US China competition that may have changed is perhaps this system of ideas that you mentioned. There used to be this notion that the United States investment in Latin America also came with goals around a certain ideology, the promotion of human rights, the promotion of democracy, perhaps environmental and labor rights, whereas China didn't promote those sorts of obligations. It was investment without ideology. Is this still true? Has that calculus changed?
It's no change for China, right? This notion of non-interference in the domestic affairs of sovereign nations is one that still governs much of, what China does, for better or worse, right? It works well for China, in terms of making its engagement attractive to wide-ranging governments across the globe. There seems to have been a shift in thinking about how to engage globally on the part of the United States, which does not necessarily embrace, right, some of the values that we've upheld in our foreign policy and through private companies in the United States, for a matter of decades. That includes, promotion and strengthening of democratic principles, democratic institutions, which in many ways are compatible with favorable investment environments, right? And also, the pausing of the Federal Corrupt Practices Act would suggest that our sensitivity to our rejection of corrupt practices in pursuit of deal making, right, is something that's not being prioritized, at least in the same way that it has been in the past. Whether the companies themselves retain a commitment to these objectives and these standards is another question, right? But certainly the government doesn't appear willing, at least for the time being, right, to uphold these particular principles from a legal perspective. The U.S. has long said that it wants to even the playing field, right, with China in Latin America and other regions as both look to compete for opportunities and for influence. The strategy before was to try to ensure that Chinese companies were raising their standards. Now, it seems the conceptualization is to even the playing field by reducing U.S. commitment to these things and to making so much of the deal making that we do far more transactional, right? Rather than trying to demonstrate the commitment to the countries that are receiving these investments by, for example, investing in ecosystems, right? And engaging with local providers and suppliers and doing so according to very high standards while also supporting through technical assistance the various functions, regulatory environments, and other things that are conducive to best practices and to long-term viability of some of these investments.
I wanted to flip the lens for a second from Washington to Beijing. Have you seen a change in how Beijing and President Xi Jinping is approaching Latin America in the past 100 days? Are they shifting their programs and their approach?
Chase, there have been some really critical shifts that have been ongoing for about 3 years, I would say, maybe even a little bit more. I think in many ways we're still seeing those, but maybe an intensification of those. So overall, what I tend to say is that we're seeing, in general, in dollar value, right, a sort of tapering of overall economic engagement. This is not necessarily true in trade. Trade is growing. Trade's going to keep growing, mostly as a form of Chinese exports to Latin America, not the other way around, right? But in total, it will continue to grow, based largely on the dynamics underway right now in the global economy, right, and the trade war underway. But investment is slowing in dollar value, right? Both in terms of mergers and acquisitions, but also in terms of greenfield. With greenfield investments, it's more of a tapering. Greenfield meaning, investments in new projects, new infrastructure, things of that nature. it's tapering, but not nearly as rapidly, right, as mergers and acquisitions, which really underpinned the relationship for many years at the kind of onset of enhanced economic engagement in the 1990s and early 2000s. And then finance, especially the sort of state-to-state finance, which was a major feature of the relationship back in 2010, 2011, and which we still talk about a lot, has essentially dropped off the map. Right? There's not new finance happening. If there is, it's to the tune of about $1 billion, which really rivals that $40 billion number, right, that we saw around 2010. So it's not at all what it used to be, and is certainly not the primary objective, as China looks to engage in very specific ways with the region. The other really important trend that we're seeing is a focusing, and this is related to the tapering, right? Those projects that China is pursuing, we're actually seeing more projects, but they're smaller in dollar value. And they are very focused on a handful of sectors that China views as critically important to its own economic development. These are sectors that China has called new infrastructure, but they're broadly innovation related, and they extend from everything ICT, right, information communications technology related. That's 5G, that's 6G, that's all of the wiring and cabling, right, that we can data centers, these things, to ultra high voltage transmission lines, to urban infrastructure, right, certainly to EVs, electric vehicles. These are products, right, that whether in terms of trade or in market-seeking investment that China is really pursuing in a much more aggressive way than it has in the past. And the expectation, both here and in China, this is going to intensify because China's at a sort of Hail Mary moment right now. Certainly the tariffs are going to impact China's growth and industrial development in rather targeted ways. But even preceding the tariffs, right, China has been in a position wherein, growth objectives were achieved to some degree in this previous quarter. But structurally speaking, right, a lot of China's drivers of growth are performing in ways that are troubling, right, and are not going to potentially be sustainable in the longer term. There has been and will continue to be an emphasis on export-led growth, but specifically in these sectors that will help to upgrade China's economy, to help it to overcome the middle income trap, which is a primary objective for China if it wants to, sustain even moderate levels of growth in the coming years. And now that other markets are closed off, right, they already were to a degree, and they increasingly are, especially the U.S. market, then markets like Latin America are that much more fundamental. And so that's what I mean by an intensification of the trends underway, right? These things have been happening for a little while now, aligned with China's industrial policy, but now there's going to be more of it. And so if we're talking competing with China, right, in this sense, we need to think about the fact that, there's just going to be a lot more coming Latin America's way. At the same time, what we are seeing is a real effort to localize, right, engagement, to ensure that the partnerships, that the relationships are there to facilitate deal making in these areas, whether at the very local level, municipal level, the provincial or state level, and certainly at the government level, engaging with various ministries to make sure the regulatory environment is aligned, but also that there is buy-in and trust, right, in China that will be permissive of more deal making at a moment when, frankly, and this is a really important point, Chase, is that there is a sense growing in Latin America that they are being inundated, right, by Chinese goods and services. And I would imagine this too will intensify, right? And so on the one hand, there's a vision of Latin America as the essential, destination for so many of these things, given its propensity to be able to use these technologies. And on the other, I can imagine that we're going to see more pushback, right, against this policy and its implications for Latin America. Because to use all of these solar panels or all of these EVs or all of the other equipment that China is exporting, this excess capacity that it has to offload, then there need to be plans, strategies, right, and projects, a pipeline of projects waiting, right, to employ these things. That context is not necessarily there in many Latin American nations.
Margaret, I can really understand why in your testimony to the Senate, you said this was a definitive moment for U.S. China competition in the region. It seems like a lot of long-term trends are coming to bear And I thought we'd end by giving maybe a little bit of a scorecard. Can we say that in the past couple months, certain countries have moved closer to Washington or Beijing? Are we seeing that sort of division yet?
What I think we're seeing is the effect of a real concerted effort on the part of China through wide-ranging communications, through speeches, through engagements at the local level, through engagements through media, through engagements in high-level fora, to demonstrate that it is the reliable partner, right? That is the terminology that is being used, not just in Latin America, but globally. And I think to some degree it's resonating. Countries are feeling that indeed, that China is seeming to stay the course on its strategy, that it's committed to sort of the same things that it's been committed to for a number of years now, that it's bringing actual investments to bear. And at least in theory, right, or in terms of how it's portraying all of this, is supportive of certain development objectives in Latin America. This is kind of the vision, and I think the vision more potentially than it has been in previous months. That said, at the very same time, we are seeing greater concern about engaging with China, right? Just broadly speaking. There are debates underway in many countries, Peru, Chile, right, about the extent of dependence on China, both in terms of a market for exports, but also for investments in certain strategic sectors, right? Wherein China maintains a dominant position in some of these sectors already. There are debates about what is a state-owned enterprise, right? And should all Chinese state-owned enterprise be considered to be, owned by the same entity? Should there be antitrust-related considerations related to these definitions? At the same time, there are other concerns about projects gone wrong, for instance, or the legacy of extensive lending that took place over a decade ago. And so, a general, I wouldn't say souring, but a degree of apprehension about an extensive engagement with China that we haven't seen in the past. And so with all of this in mind, right, I think the strategy, broadly speaking, is one of diversification, of looking to engage with as many actors as possible, right, as many countries as possible to achieve economic objectives, to expand the range of trade partners, right, to attract investment from wide-ranging actors, to ensure that there isn't too much reliance either on the U.S. at this juncture or on China, even though these two countries obviously factor most prominently from an economic perspective. It's a real moment, I think, of strategic thinking among Latin American governments as they look to navigate what has been, for a long time, a very difficult dynamic and continues to be.
Margaret, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We've really appreciated your analysis.
Thank you so much, Trace.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Luisa Lemi. This episode was produced by Fabrício Ricalde. I'm the executive producer for the show. If it touches on Trump's policies in Latin America, we are covering on our website. Go to as-coa.org/Trump to read more about trade, migration, and more. You can see also a nice list of which leaders from Latin America have traveled to China. Find the links on our episode notes. The music in this podcast is Alexandre and Douglas Lora performing Mamãe Oxum at America Society. Find out about upcoming concerts happening here at America Society in New York City at musicoftheamericas.org. And check out the notes of this episode about becoming a member of America Society, with preferential seating in concerts and arts and cultural events. If you listen up to here, check out our other episodes of Latin American Focus at as-coa.org/podcast, or write us an email telling what you think. Share this episode and the show with other Latin American aficionados, and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more, visit as-coa.org.